Recently, there have been some significant warnings about the possibility of a war between NATO and Russia within the next 5 years, and it's been coming from some quite significant sources like defense ministers and generals in NATO. So I thought it would be interesting to make a video about that and discuss what on earth they're talking about, because it has caused a lot of discussion, and many people have said that it shows that the European countries need to speed up the process of making investments in the armed forces and in defense production, and that it shows why it's important to send more help to Ukraine. But others have said that this is alarmist and that there is no reason to believing that Russia will actually attack NATO. So what should we make of this? And I actually think that the situation is more dangerous than most people believe. So I'm in the first group of people, those who believe that a war is a real possibility that we need to take seriously. But I also think there are some very big misunderstandings about what that war would look like, and that this is one of the reasons why people call it alarmist and why they dismiss the possibility. So let's talk about it. The idea that Russia might attack NATO will seem surreal to most people that you meet on the street in a Western capital. After all, if you look at the size of the NATO military and the size of the Russian military, it seems unlikely that Russia will take on the entirety of NATO, because they would be absolutely destroyed in a head-to-head decisive battle. And right now, Russia has plenty of problems just fighting the Ukrainian army. So how on earth could they think that they could win a war against all of NATO? But I think that this image of what the war will look like is based on two important misunderstandings. The first one is that when that war happens, then NATO will look the same as it does today. So that means that in this potential war between Russia and NATO, then Russia will be up against the combined military forces of all NATO members, including the United States. And the other misunderstanding is that this war will be a war about territory. And this is actually a very classical misunderstanding. Like, people tend to very quickly think about wars in terms of territory that is changing hands, even when it's actually about something else. And they imagine then that Russia, this war between Russia and NATO, would be about territory, where Russia would be trying to conquer some country and annex it and take it back into the Russian Empire, right? But I think both of these assumptions are wrong. And to explain why that is the case, then I want to start with a few remarks about how Russia understands international politics and how they envision their role in the world. The thing to understand is that the Russian ideal for how the international system is supposed to be working is that there is a system of bilateral relationships. So this is a system where the different countries negotiate and interact with each other directly, and where we don't have all these kinds of international organizations and different kinds of regulation that sort of interfere in that direct relationship. And this is actually an ideal that they share with Donald Trump. Like, he had many of those same ideas, that it would be better for the United States to get out of those international organizations. But the reason why Russia would prefer to have bilateral relations with other countries is, of course, that this would allow Russia to negotiate from a position of strength. Because if Russia is up against the European Union or against NATO, then they are the small one. But if they can deal with all the individual countries on a one-on-one basis, then they're much stronger. So what international organizations do is that they create conditions where the great powers cannot exercise power that easily over the small countries, and the small countries get more influence because the international system is regulated by different rules and international sort of regulatory bodies and organizations and stuff like that. So Russia knows that they cannot win a war against NATO if NATO stands together. And that is why when we're talking about the risk of a war between Russia and NATO, then obviously it's not Russia's plan to fight a war against the entire NATO bloc, because even a blind man can see that Russia would lose that war. But it is absolutely Russia's goal to undermine NATO to the point where the Western alliance might break up. Right? Because that will create that international system where they can deal with all the European countries on a bilateral basis. And this is the thing we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the risk of a war between Russia and NATO. Russia's most important goal is not to take territory, but it is to cause NATO to break up. Because if they can challenge Article 5 and the big countries are not willing to go to war, then NATO is practically dead. And then Russia can always take territory later, or they can use that position of power to dominate over Eastern Europe. So that's the war we're talking about. It will not be about taking territory. It will be about challenging Article 5. And it's not unreasonable to think that maybe the United States will not actually fight for the European NATO countries. When we look at the current political deadlock in the U.S. Congress about funding for Ukraine, then the next logical question is, of course, why do we think the United States will be there for the European allies if there is a war in Europe? And if I'm thinking that thought, that maybe the United States will not actually fulfill their NATO commitments, then of course Vladimir Putin is thinking the same thing, that maybe there is a possibility for Russia here. And that's why a war is not unthinkable, because it's not actually Russia's plan to fight against NATO. The plan would be to convince NATO not to fight. And it is possible that they would be able to do that by making some kind of aggression against NATO that should trigger Article 5, but where it just turns out that a large group of NATO countries are not willing to come and help another country. And this is the core thing to understand about an alliance here. NATO's Article 5 is not just a guarantee that other countries will come and help you if your country is in trouble. It also means that you have to come and help the others. And if the countries are not willing to fulfill those commitments, then NATO will fall apart. And most significantly, if the United States is not willing to do that, then that is, in practice, the end of NATO. So we're not talking about a big war where Russia will attack all of NATO with all of their forces. We're talking about some kind of aggression where, from a Russian point of view, it would be about carefully managing escalation. So you will push hard enough that there is a clear aggression and that Article 5 should be invoked, but where you don't actually push so hard that it actually happens, but where you will have a group of countries that will say, this is not worth going to war over. Why should our soldiers die for that? Things will only get worse if we attack. It might cause escalation, all these things. So the challenge will be to manage escalation in a way where it's still possible for the NATO countries that are not directly involved to say that, no, we don't actually want to fight this war. And that means that you have to frame the aggression in some way where it would be up to NATO to decide whether to escalate or not. And then the countries should have a feeling that they actually have a choice. They can say that, let's give peace a chance. Let's decide not to go to war. So just to give an example of what that might look like, then there are often these discussions about Russia. They might be attacking the Baltic countries, for example, or attack Poland or something. But I think that scenario is maybe a bit too aggressive. It's a very complex scenario where it would be hard to control the escalation because there's just so many things going on, and there are many countries that would be almost automatically involved in that war. So I think a more likely scenario is perhaps some kind of aggression in an area that is more remote, an area where there will be fewer countries involved, and where it will be more easy for the other NATO countries to stay out of the conflict. So when I look at the map, I think a more likely place for a Russian attack on NATO is something like northern Finland. It could be that Russia says, for example, they want to establish a security zone or whatever. That area is very remote. And at first, there are only two countries involved, Russia and Finland. So I think it's a perfect place for Russia to test the resolve of NATO, to see if the other NATO countries are actually willing to go to war over a small part of Lapland. And if it does turn out that the other NATO countries are, in fact, willing to do that, and that the United States is willing to risk World War III over some remote part of Lapland, then that's also an area where it would be possible to control escalation. It would be easier than in some densely populated area like one of the Baltic states. And I think it would almost certainly be possible for Russia to find some kind of off-ramp in that situation. So I think it's something like that we should have in mind when we talk about the risk of a war between Russia and NATO within the next 5 years. Like, it will not be a war where Russia is fighting the entire military force of the whole alliance, but rather it would be some kind of challenge to Article 5, and where they will see if they can make NATO collapse. And of course, that also means that when we talk about the need for the Western countries to prepare for such a war, then the Western countries must also be ready to fight. And they must be ready to fight even if there is no actual threat against their own country or their own population. Because if they don't do that, and it turns out that Article 5 was just hot air, then in practice, NATO is dead. And then after NATO is dead, we will have a new geopolitical reality in Europe where Russia is in a position of strength and where they can deal with all the other European countries on a bilateral basis. So that's why it's not unrealistic to talk about a possible war between Russia and NATO within the next 5 years, because Russia can actually do that without running a huge risk. And it would be up to the Western countries to demonstrate that they stand together and that they're willing to go to war for each other. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful or informative, then give it a like, and also subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.